Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. Today we have another devblog, and this is quite a step up, we'll say, compared to some of the other stuff that we've seen. So recently we had the Leopard 2K, which in my opinion was a small step above what we see the KPZ and the MBT70 being, and now we've just taken a gigantic leap above that in the form of British engineering. This is the Challenger 1. Now, if you don't know the history of the Challenger 1 or anything about it, the Challenger 2 right now is the main battle tank used by the British Armed Forces. The Challenger 1 is the predecessor of it. It has a 120mm rifled gun. It also was one of the early adopters of this armor that we know as Chobham armor, which is CHOBHAM armor. This armor is still classified at this current point of talking. So therefore, we know kind of how it works, but we don't know how it works when it comes to effective thicknesses, when it comes to what's actually in it. All we really know is that it is a mixture of alloys and different things, and maybe some depleted uranium, which is on the later versions, so the later Abrams and the Challenger 2 and stuff like that. But we know that it's basically a mixture of some kind of layers of stuff, which means that it's harder for shells to get through it. We have a rough estimate of the effective thickness of the thing, but that's it. And this is what I talked about in the past being a massive issue. Once we start going even later, the Challenger 1 is an 80s to 90s vehicle. It is one of the latest that we've seen in the game so far. It is going to be rank 6. I would say 9.3, 9.7, 10.0. This is not a 9.0 vehicle. This is a massive step up from the MBTs and also the T64A, which are the two main competitors right now in War Thunder. So we're looking at higher than 9.0, so this is the next big step in, tanks in general, in ground forces. But as you start getting to where the Challenger 1 was created, the 80s and the very early 90s until it was, pretty much put out of service. Not the early 90s, I mean the early 2000s. One of the biggest issues we have is classified information, which is where all modern tank games struggle with. So I want to see how they get around this. And something else that always worries me about when we have classified information, or when we have unknown information with vehicles, such as prototypes or paper stuff. The R2Y2 comes to mind, the I-185 comes to mind. It gives creative license to Gaijin in areas which I don't like, because it takes away from the realism aspect of the game and goes towards the balancing aspect of the game. And depending on where you sit on that fence, that's completely fine, but in my opinion, we should stick to the realistic side and use other areas of the game to try and balance these vehicles. So what do you get out of the Challenger 1? As I said before, you have a 120mm rifled L11 cannon. This gun can fire Sabo, fin-stabilized Sabo, fin-stabilized Sabo with depleted uranium in them. It can also fire HESH shells. It can also fire HESH-P shells, which are a better version, or squash head, I think is probably the best way to put it. So what you're getting out of this is pretty much what you have on the Chieftain, but just better when it comes to armor penetration statistics, when it comes to velocity statistics. So if you're used to the L7, it's going to be very similar to this. What you're also getting is a stabilizer. It's also manually reloaded, so no automatic loader in this. We have a crew of 4 in this vehicle. 4 became pretty much the standard by the 80s, having 3 in the turret and 1 in the hull. The hull lad being, of course, the driver. Then you have the loader, the gunner, and the commander in the turret. So what you're getting is because it's manual loaded, you can actually change the reload depending on how good your crew is. This is something that we see in the Leopard 2K. This is also going to be something that is going to be very, very important when we have a look at other vehicles around this BR, or at least should be around this BR. So you're getting the 120mm with hopefully a good reload, around about 8 to 10 seconds. I would probably say around 8, but once again, they can change that depending on how they feel when it comes to balancing the thing. An incredibly fast shell. Chobham armor, which we don't know a lot about, apart from it's incredibly effective against pretty much every shell out there. Not as good against... what would you call them? Like a fin stabilized Saber, like APFS DS. Much more useful against stuff like Hesh and Heat, but still incredibly useful against kinetic rounds, which is what they're called. You also have an engine which is massive, 1200 horsepower on this engine, but what it's going to struggle with, the big weakness of the Challenger, at least compared to what else is in the game, is going to be the acceleration, just like the Chieftain tanks, and that is something you're going to have to take into account. So what we have an amazing gun, which is backed up by an insane turret. We have great armor, which we can't even comprehend how good it is, because it's still all classified, but it will have a slightly weaker engine compared to what you may see from other vehicles, such as the Leopard 2K. But I just don't... When I look at the Leopard 2K, I think, okay, this probably could be 9.0, just because it's very similar to the KPZ. It is faster, it does the meta areas better than what a KPZ does at higher tier, but still it's not a huge step up. The Challenger is just on a different level to stuff like the MBT and the KPZ. The MBT was, if you want to argue this, was the first initial prototype of what we know now as the Abrams series. Then you had the XM1, the XM2, you also had an XM, I believe it was either the 85 or something like that, like the 185, which was pretty much a bridge between the MBT 70 and the XM1, and then you had the Abrams, the M1A1. So, the Challenger 1 is like taking all of those prototypes and throwing them out the window and just plonking in the Abrams. That's how I see it, the M1A1, not the M1A2. Because of all the massive advances that this thing is going to have. Now, yes, there is a lot of mechanics in the game which are non-existent, that the Challenger could really benefit from. Such as certain laser-guided systems and all of this. But the main core mechanics of gun, armor, speed, reload, it all does really well, apart from the speed part. So what we have here is a new king in the jungle. This is going to be the top-tier tank that we have seen so far. And we're going to go, as you can see at the top of the screen, we're going to go into some other vehicles that are comparable to it, maybe slightly better, slightly worse, depending on how you see it, that will probably get added to the game now that we see the Challenger tank. It just... When I talked about it before, I talked about... it was mainly talking about aircraft, but I was also talking about... tanks at the time. We get to a period in time where we run into a lot of classified information and a lot of stuff that we're going to have to make up, or at least guess. And depending on which side they guess on, the Challenger will either be insanely good and one of the best vehicles in the game, which they've kind of written in the text for the Devblog, or it's going to be crippled by what I would call selective additions. So what I'm talking about here is obviously the armor. Are they going to make this thing penetrable from the front with the general shells that we're going to see? The Leopard 2K, if they give it its proper shell, which is very similar to the 120mm rifled L11 shell, which is pretty much the fin-stabilized discarding saber with depleted uranium in it. If they give it that, then it can maybe penetrate the Challenger 1 from the front. Maybe is a big thing here. But then at the same time, the Challenger 1 could also use that round. So that means that the Challenger 1 is going to have everything over something like a Leopard 2K. We're going to have to see what they decide is going to go up against this behemoth. But yeah, when we look at jets, right now in game, we are pretty much 60s, 70s if you want to go 70s, but it's mainly 60s. So with this new update, which I believe is called Advancing Storm, according to the Twitter of Gaijin right now, what we're going to see is hopefully a bunch of rank 6 aircraft to go along with these, which still will run into the same issues as the tanks, but at least with the aircraft we have a bunch of new ways that can be added to the game, such as air-to-ground missiles, air-to-air missiles, the locking mechanics, even helicopters. All of these may be added in a very interesting way to deal with stuff like the Challenger. So let's go through what other nations may have, because right now there is nothing comparable to this in-game. There is nothing that can fight this. This is your top tier vehicle as of today, until there is another devblog for something else, and then we can start talking about how it stacks up against the vehicles of its era. Because right now we don't have any of those vehicles. We have a Leopard 2 prototype, that's it, which is just not comparable. That's much more comparable to, as I said, the KPZ. So let's go through. This is going to be the top tier vehicle right now. Let's go through some of the things it will probably go up against. First of all, you have the M1 Abrams. The M1 Abrams also has Chobham armor, so once again, can have a bit of creative freedom. The main difference between the M1A1 and the Challenger is the M1A1 is faster, and also it sports a 105. The M1A2, if they decide to add it, which I believe is the main battle tank of the Americans right now, has the 120mm on it. So if they add the M1A1 Abrams, what you are trading is slightly quicker machine with a slightly smaller gun. That is pretty much it. Everything else is very similar. Crew layout, reload time, smoke, grenades, pretty much everything is very similar on that machine. The next one, the Leopard II. Now this is the Leopard II-A5, but in my opinion, something like a Leopard II-A2 or something like that is much more comparable to the Challenger. So I know a lot of you are probably hoping for what we saw in the April Fool's event, which is the Leopard II-A5, I believe, but the Leopard II-A2 is probably the one that we're going to see. This machine has probably worse armor, but a very comparable gun, and also it is faster than the Challenger once again. The next nation, because we're going to go through all the nations here. This is the Leclerc. It is the French main battle tank of the time. What you get out of this is pretty much a worse version of what you have on the 3 tanks that I've just shown. It is comparable though, mainly because of time period, but if we actually talk about is it as good as the other 3? No, I don't think it is, because it is too worse in too many different areas. The next one. This is the T-80. So a lot of people have talked about the T-72 being comparable to the Challenger. I want people to go and read about Operation Desert Storm and how the M1A1 did against the T-72. The T-72s, yes, they didn't have the perfect crews behind them. Yes, maybe you could say because they were well, not lend-lease, but they were bought off the Russians, but they weren't proper T-72 Russian tanks because of the crews and all of this. Yeah, fair enough. But the T-72s in Operation Desert Storm were ripped apart by the M1A1, and in my opinion, the Challenger one is better than the M1A1. That can be debated, but even if we debate it, you can at least say they are on comparable levels. So what we have is a T-72 that would just be straight inferior, unless you pick the T-72B with all of its upgrades, but it would still be inferior to those two vehicles and the Leopard II. So the T-80 is the way to go in my opinion, which is the upgrade of the T-72. If we look at the Italians, yes, the Italians aren't in game yet, but that's completely fine, because we can still speculate. This is the C1 Ariete, which is pretty much the Italian main battle tank of today, and it is very similar to what you see on the M1A1. It is slightly worse, but at least it would be comparable compared to what we have now, which is pretty much nothing for the Italians. And then we go to the Japanese. Now, one of the main reasons I think they are going as far as they are with the Challenger 1, so what I said, like 80s, 90s, is because if you look at the tanks which were created by the Japanese in the periods of the 60s to the 80s, maybe even into the 90s, there isn't a lot to go on. You pretty much have the Type 74, which we already have in game, and then you have a few versions of that Type 74. There are a few dodgy pictures that I can't tell if they're real or not, or if they're out of a game, but there seems to be some kind of Type 74, the G variant, which has ERA on it. This will be useless against all of the tanks I've just listed right now, because their main weapon, or the main ammo of choice is APFSDS. So ERA won't help you. So what you've got to do is you've got to find something else. And the Type 90 is the first prototype actual tank that the Japanese built after the Type 74. Nowadays, we have a different Japanese vehicle, but that is a 2000s vehicle, so that would be similar to something like a Challenger 2 or an M1A2 Abrams. So the Type 90 is the one you have to pick. This is the reason why I think they've gone for the Challenger 1 instead of some of the Challenger prototypes or some of the American prototypes. Because if you look at the XM1 or the X1M, that vehicle is inferior to the Challenger 1 in every single way, because it is not as good as the M1A1, which at least is on par with it. So what we have is a situation where they've skipped all of those prototypes, the Challenger prototypes such as the MBT-80 and also the MBT-90, which was created by the British. They've skipped those and just gone straight to the Challenger. So if you add in any of these prototypes, such as the Leopard 2K, they're going to be inferior to this machine. It's interesting to think about, and something that should be become more apparent to us in the next few weeks, depending on what they actually want to add to concentrate this machine. Because right now, this does not have any equal, and the Brit Bongers are going to be just tearing ass. Yes, it doesn't fit the meta perfectly because of its speed, but everything else about this vehicle is infinitely superior to what we have or what we have seen coming into the game. The way to balance this is either throw in all those vehicles that I've just talked about, or on the flip side, bring in rank 6 aircraft to deal with these from the air, because you ain't gonna be able to deal with these in your T-64A. The Challengers will just stick it in Cruise Control 1 and just walk into you and absolutely annihilate you. The MBTs, oh well, we can flank the Challengers. Not a whole damn team of them. They're gonna rip you apart. Same with the KPZ and the Leopard. Oh, we can flank. No, you can't. Not with experienced players on the maps that we're playing with right now. Type 74s don't even give me that. AMX-30s, nowhere near this damn thing. The only thing that the French can get is the Leclerc or the AMX-40, which is even slightly comparable to the Challenger. This is such a big step up, and I know a lot of people are celebrating, myself included. I think the Challenger 1 being added is really cool because I personally love the Challenger. I think it's a really interesting tank. It's one of the best tanks ever made when it comes to a efficiency point of view. I really love the Challenger 2 as well. But there are so many questions that are going to be answered in these next weeks, which are either going to be thrilling or they're going to be absolutely terrifying for the general War Thunder player. And that, to me, is the worry. That we either get some statistics on the Challenger 1's armor that they're going to add to the game, and it's just completely ridiculous and nowhere near what it should be, or they go the other way, and this thing becomes insane, but they add everything else to compensate. It's going to be an interesting time in Update 1.77, and it really depends on if they do this staggered release of what they've done in the past. So what we had like a few years ago is the fact that each nation would get a specific really good vehicle at a time, and then in later updates, vehicles would come out for other nations to face it. But in that time, where it was just that one vehicle against nothing really else that we had, it stopped. What we saw with the addition of Rank 6 was a bunch of vehicles added at once, which were all pretty much comparable. The Chieftain Mark 10, the T-64A, KPZ, MBT. They were all comparable to each other, and I hope that we get that in Update 1.77 as well. Not just have one tank rule the roost, like it would do if only this thing was added along with like the XM1, or the Leopard 2K, or the T-72. The Challenger will just wreck face, and it just will. So yeah, that's pretty much my opinion on this thing. I am really looking forward to it, and hopefully the dev server is up soon. I'm hoping that this update drops in March, since that seems to be when other updates of this time, like in the new year, you generally get a March update. So we'll see how it goes, but I'm looking forward to it. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and Rule Britannia.